In this holy moment, hearts awaken to the whispers of the eternal. You lean back, wearing that self-satisfied grin. After all, you predicted this downfall months ago. Around you, everyone else stands wide-eyed at the wreckage, as if it appeared out of nowhere. They once dismissed you as an alarmist, too intense and a bit obsessed. Now, however, they're forced to swallow a bitter slice of reality. You didn't predict the end. You simply stayed alert while everyone else wandered through a hall of mirrors. They strolled along with blinders on, oblivious to the cracks forming at their feet. But you cut through the haze and recognized every telltale sign. Your gift has always been uncovering reality in scenes others mistook for fine theater, lost in their applause for underwhelming acts. Now that the illusion is collapsing, it's your clear sight that leaves them reeling. You sensed the hidden undercurrents beneath their polished words. You noticed the subtle tremor in their pitch, the falters in their tales, and how the air shifted whenever a sensitive topic arose. Instead of applauding their rehearsed performances, you tuned into the silences between their sentences and tracked the patterns in their behavior. Conditioned to be captivated by charm, volume, or bravado, most people miss these soft signals, but not you. You've seen enough, experienced enough, and lost enough to know when parts of a puzzle don't fit, even while everyone else acts as though they do. There's no paranoia here. This is pattern recognition that has been refined by truth and experience. You were concurrently becoming aware of 3 distinct revelations, but you were unaware of how interconnected they would eventually become. The first was personal, gradually realizing that your sensitivity was a radar system to be trusted rather than a weakness that needed to be corrected. Second, there was the realization that what appeared to be community was actually performance art. The third was systemic, the bone-deep understanding that denial-based foundations don't merely crumble, they fall apart. You realized something basic that others won't accept. Stability and motion are 2 different things. You were studying the basis, and they were celebrating the image. You were doubting the intentions, while they praised the marketing. You remained sober enough to notice the creaking underneath, while they were intoxicated by the sound. You become the issue as soon as you began to speak your truth. You were correct at precisely the wrong moment for their comfort, not because you were incorrect. Your insight came before they were prepared. Furthermore, when people are unprepared for the truth, they attack the messenger who delivered it rather than simply rejecting it. Wave after wave of derision, the eye rolls, snarky remarks, and subtle jabs veiled in jokes that weren't actually funny can happen behind your back or right in front of you. They reacted as though you were reaching, exaggerating, or fabricating something out of nothing, even though you spoke with real care. Yellow heart if you feel the divine love. Now is the time to share. Click the super thank you button on YouTube to contribute $50 or more and help us spread God's blessings. What you do is being watched and serves as a seed, and in the future it will come back to you 1,000,000-fold. But they also felt it, deep down, in areas they didn't want to admit. They simply lacked the courage to face it. They chose to target you instead. You first experienced the loneliness of being early during this stage of your awakening. You were living in the reality of tomorrow. Every conversation turned into a translation exercise, while everyone else was still intoxicated by the promises made yesterday. If you insist on seeing only sunshine, how can you explain storm clouds? How can you alert those who are still enjoying the new paint to the possibility of structural damage? Making fun of the messenger is usually simpler than accepting the message. Laughing is easier than listening. Dismissing is easier than looking into it. They therefore called you dramatic, challenging, and overly analytical. They were so desperate for you to be wrong that they persuaded themselves that your warnings were meaningless. However, you weren't trying to make money or attract attention. All you were doing was refusing to remain blind at a time when blindness was the religion of the masses. Not being right was the most difficult thing. It didn't want to be correct. You weren't secretly yearning for their demise or hoping for mayhem. You spoke up because you were unable to ignore your gut's cries, and because you couldn't deceive yourself the way others appeared to be able to. You made the more difficult decision to embrace the reality, while others adhered to the narrative they wanted to believe. Clarity like this costs everything. It costs you relationships, comfort, and occasionally even your mental health. Because there's no turning back once you see something for what it really is. It is impossible to ignore the deception, the phony allegiance, and the meticulously crafted stories meant to keep people asleep. And when you attempted to draw attention to it, you turned into the one who was bringing the celebration to a halt with your annoying remarks. Something important was happening under the surface of your conscious knowledge during this time. Your internal compass was adjusting to distinguish between staged bonding and genuine connection. You didn't decide to learn this skill in reaction to recurrent experiences with emotional concealment. It was a survival instinct. However, you had no intention of destroying anything. You could see the impending collapse with heartbreaking clarity, and you were working to stop it. Ships mistook your warning light for an attack on their navigation, even though you were the lighthouse attempting to steer them away from the rocks. When you were attempting to stop a fire, they dubbed you a fire. You sensed something as the months went by that others were not yet able to notice. The insidious rot beginning before the visible degradation appeared. The vibe shifted. First, things that had previously felt genuine and alive began to feel artificial and staged. The once genuine joy turned into a fake one. The grins tightened. If you give $65, you start not just a project, but a story that changes destiny. The praise sounded scripted. The room was on life support and no longer prospering. Furthermore, no one wanted to acknowledge the patient's death. While everyone else continued to post highlights and act as though everything was perfect, you were already mourning what had once been. You had witnessed the sincerity, passion, and genuineness evaporating into meticulously staged displays. You had already dealt with the emotional fallout of the conclusion long before anyone else was prepared to admit that anything was amiss. So you didn't flinch when the inevitable collapse finally occurred. Your second transformation started at this point. When you understood your truth was in danger in their hands, you stopped speaking. Every time you attempted to communicate honestly, it was misrepresented, reframed, and used against you. They were listening in order to locate ammunition, not to comprehend. Thus, you made the wise decision to remain silent strategically rather than out of fear. You realized that sometimes it's better to keep your truth close to the vest than to expose it to those who would only seek to destroy it. No argument could have been heard over your quiet. It was the time you stopped pleading for understanding and began getting ready for the impending storm. When you fell silent, everybody noticed. They believed you had lost your motivation and had ran out of things to say. They were unaware that your silence was a means of regaining control in a situation where words had turned into weapons against the person speaking. Another revelation was crystallizing in the meantime. You started to realize that persuading people of anything was not your job. It was to stay steadfast, while everyone else had to learn the hard way. Being correct wasn't the point here. It has to do with readiness. Everyone who disregarded your cautions was destroying the narrative you were creating for the future. But you were creating something even when you were silent. You were connecting with those who had also seen past the mask, while they enjoyed their illusions and performed their unity. You discovered your tribe, not those who shared your opinions on every issue, but those who prioritized clarity over agreement and truth over comfort. When it was safe, these were not the spectators who applauded from the sidelines. When standing meant making sacrifices, these were the warriors who would be there for you. You discovered how to tell the difference between people who merely wanted a show and those who sought change, until it demanded their name, until it caused chaos, until it compelled them to take a real risk. The observers liked a good revolt. But when the going got tough, the warriors came forward. When the stakes increased, they remained unflinching. They realized that builders require other builders, not onlookers. You saw something that went beyond the mockery or the silence during this time of awakening. You saw loyalty turn into power. What started out as sincere encouragement and a common goal gradually turned into a planned tactic. People were sustaining partnerships because they were advantageous, secure, and profitable, not because they shared a common belief. Their obligations changed along with the tides, out of sheer convenience, not of development or true realization. You knew it was opportunism, but they called it evolution. The way they began speaking in half-truths and keeping a safe distance to jump ship when things became awkward were signs that their vibe had changed. It was impossible to point this out without coming out as resentful or suspicious. You silently observed as people's genuine motivations were exposed, not in the way they helped others when things were going well, but rather in how swiftly they vanished when standing by someone became inconvenient. Dove, brother and sister, everything done in faith is returned in God's abundance. You can donate $100 using the Super Thank You button and be part of this divine call. If your roots are connected to Him, your fruit will be blessed. Some folks, were never really loyal to anything. They only cared about their personal comfort, and their integrity was also at risk when that comfort was in jeopardy. This realization coincided with your developing consciousness of something even more unsettling. The group you believed you were a part of was turning out to be something else. What at first seemed like a genuine connection turned out to be sophisticated staging, complete with costumes, scripts, and meticulously planned reactions. You found more layers as you dug deeper into this performance. Unspoken hierarchies were passed off as equality. Rivalry was passed off as teamwork, and manipulation was passed off as mentoring. Individuals were networking from profile to profile rather than soul to soul. Everyone was trying to sell something at every meeting, even if it was only a picture of themselves. It seemed like a convention. In order to keep the appearance of togetherness, you started to observe how talks followed predictable patterns and how specific sentences were repeated like mantras. The language itself had been turned into a weapon. Words like community, growth, and authentic have lost their meaning and became catchphrases for the brand. Most often, when someone mentioned transformation, they were referring to their social media presence. They meant to market their suffering when they spoke about healing. The pathologization of disagreement, however, was arguably the most unsettling. Not only were those who challenged the narrative incorrect, but they were also poisonous, unsupportive, and out of step with the goal. Dissent was diagnosed, not discussed. Critical thought was viewed as a hindrance to progress, and was not encouraged. In order to avoid being ostracized from the only society they had ever found, you saw as clever individuals gradually educated themselves out of their own discernment. Perhaps the most terrible discovery that resulted from this was that what you believed to be a community was actually a costume party. Initially, it appeared to be a group of people working together with a sincere goal, encouraging one another, and creating something significant. However, the seams became more noticeable the longer you stayed. The assistance seemed practiced. Praise was given too readily, too rapidly, and only in front of witnesses. Everyone had a part to play, and what was being marketed as an authentic community was actually a performance. You began to realize how people were praised for their influence rather than their character, and how love had turned into a transaction. How exposure, not trust, was the foundation of relationships. Visibility was more important than authenticity. Clout, not connection, was the key to collaboration. You were subtly kicked out of the game if you didn't follow their rules, not because you were mistaken, but because you wouldn't have worn the outfit that maintained the illusion. There was no such thing as a community. With strings connected to every ounce of praise and price tags on loyalty, it was a marketplace masquerading as a family. You became invisible the instant you ceased to serve the illusion, not because you were no longer valuable, but rather because you no longer fit their script. Realizing how much effort you had put into something that was never real was what made this discovery more devastating. You had truly believed in the purpose, truly cared about these people, and had felt that you were a part of something that would change the world. However, your genuineness had been feeding a machine that was made to take in sincerity and generate content. The fact that they had been acting was not the only violation. Your authenticity had served as the foundation for their fabricated creation. Their credibility had been transformed from your weakness. Their knowledge was a repackaging of your thoughts. Their success narrative has turned your development into a commodity. You were a resource they were mining, not a part of their community. A deep loneliness that beyond mere social isolation accompanied this realization. Not only were you alone, but you were alone in a society where most people had forgotten what it was like to feel truly connected. They had exchanged truth for comfort, depth for prominence, and honesty for acceptability. Furthermore, it was impossible to hide the trade they had made once it was visible. You already know the game is rigged, don't you? And you can tell the walls are closing in if you're listening. Let's discuss our current course of action. To be heard, to be held, to be dealt a fair hand. When you live your life at the mercy of the market, where property and profit govern the land. When you give $80, you extend a hand to heaven, and God fills it with miracles. At about the same time, it was getting harder to ignore another pattern. The individuals who had positioned themselves as leaders were actually feeding off of everything rather than leading anything. Their choices were made mostly to keep themselves in the spotlight, not to help others achieve greater things. Every statement, vision, and call to action was more about protecting one's ego than it was about serving others. You saw how they surrounded themselves with people who would not question them, how criticism was greeted with exile rather than discussion, and how challenging their practices was viewed as treachery rather than concern. In reality, what appeared to be leadership was performance art, and what appeared to be wisdom turned out to be repeated sound bites meant to keep the plaudits going. These so-called leaders were experts at saying everything that didn't mean anything. They used motivational abstractions that sounded deep but had no practical meaning. Since genuine change would jeopardize their standing at the top of a system that was established on maintaining people reliant on them, they promised transformation while making sure that nothing essential ever changed. You started to observe how they created problems they could later publicly resolve, how they fabricated crises to be relevant, and how they positioned themselves as both the cause and the solution to the drama that kept everyone emotionally hooked. They were using manufactured urgency and shared outrage to create a fake intimacy with their followers, forming trauma bonds. The most pernicious aspect was how they used people's sincere aspirations for personal development as a weapon. They transformed the spiritual hunger of the most susceptible seekers, those who were genuinely dedicated to improving themselves as people, into spiritual materialism. They marketed wisdom as a subscription service, health as a service, and enlightenment as a product. Perhaps what most troubled you, though, was seeing how they progressively cut people off from their inner wisdom. They taught their followers to reject their own perceptions and submit to the leader's version of reality by using a combination of subtle gaslighting and love bombing. They produced control under the pretext of liberation, dependency under the guise of empowerment. Without expressing regret, you outgrew their story. They had given you a persona that suited them well, someone who remained modest, amiable, and consistent. Their story benefited from your role. However, growth doesn't request consent. Furthermore, yours put the whole dynamic they had established around keeping you in that box in jeopardy. Because it interfered with their ability to manage the plot, your growth felt like disobedience to them. You were just becoming the person you were always supposed to be. You weren't rebelling. However, genuine development appears to be treachery to those who invested in your lesser version. But independence had its own set of difficulties. You entered what seemed like a wide wilderness of uncertainty as soon as you left the performance. You had to discover who you truly were beneath all the training, without the accustomed roles and scripts, without the continuous external validation, and without the community that had grown to be your entire universe. You experienced a peculiar mix of relief and grief during this time in your journey. Even though you now realized that belonging had depended on your obedience, you nevertheless lamented the loss of it. You lamented the friendships that were unable to endure as you matured. You felt sorry for the dreams that had been based on false foundations, even though you knew they had never been based on your own nature. Glowing star if you want to witness God's miracles. Act now. Contribute $100 or more through Super Thank You on YouTube. Your offering is like a seed that comes back to you when planted. Let His light illuminate your steps. Every donation is an echo in His plan. Although you were relieved of the burden of caring for them, there was a rising sense of true serenity amid this loss that you hadn't had in years. You weren't performing for anyone for the first time in as long as you could remember. You weren't controlling anyone's feelings. You weren't converting your reality into manageable servings for others who couldn't finish the entire feast. You were just being yourself, without regret or justification. You also started to see that your experience with deceit and disappointment had been preparation rather than punishment. Your sense of truth had been honed by every lie you had exposed. Your boundaries had been reinforced by every manipulation you had encountered. Your dedication to authenticity had been made clear by every performance you had seen. We have now reached the point where everything comes together. The three distinct developments in your awareness, personal, societal, and systemic, all of a sudden became apparent as components of a unified truth. Instead of making you paranoid, your increased sensitivity had prepared you. Your neighborhood wasn't the only place where you saw the performance. It was the foundation of a denial-based society. The collapse you had been expecting was unavoidable, not a coincidence. You've been carrying the truth all along, so you're not frantically looking for answers when everything they constructed on denial falls apart just as you predicted. You knew the basis upon which this collapse was built, but you didn't foresee it. You were focusing on the structure, pointing out the shortcuts and missing supports, while others were preoccupied with the momentum and shine. You understood that anything based on avoidance eventually has a cost. The collapse was not unexpected since it was never the product of a single instance of failure, but rather the unavoidable outcome of cultural trends that valued image over integrity, stifled inquiries rather than pursuing solutions, and chose denial over the truth. It was evident in every phony grin, every avoided conversation, and every instance where someone used the phrase, "stay positive," to silence valid worries. You were grounded, not negative. You were aware that without foundation, motion will eventually collide with gravity. And you were more assured of the result the more they blatantly disregarded the warning indications. You could read the blueprint they were following, not because you wanted it. The design had collapse built in from the start. You wanted validation from this encounter, not closure. You weren't waiting at any door for an explanation or an apology. You weren't looking for approval from those who have altered history to suit their own interests. Quietly and profoundly, you sought proof that you weren't going crazy, that your feelings were genuine, and that your intuition was correct. Realizing that closure is frequently a trap set up to keep you bound to stories that have already written their conclusions gave you freedom. You began to believe that truth has its own timetable and stopped looking for answers from those who were busy making up new lies. You only needed to be sure that your understanding of reality was accurate. You didn't need someone else to bring you clarity. And now, without doing a thing, you're receiving that proof as the masks come off and the acts conclude, as individuals start to break apart in precisely the ways you secretly foreseen. The way people show their true selves when the lights go off and the crowd leaves is slowly but surely revealing the truth. However, you're just now starting to realize the responsibility that comes with this confirmation. You now possess something valuable and uncommon, the capacity to guide others through their own journey from performance to authenticity. You have seen through the deception, made it through the wilderness of awakening, and emerged with your integrity intact. You've witnessed enough of that performative hierarchy to know that it's not the solution. Therefore, this doesn't imply becoming a teacher or leader in the conventional sense. Rather, it entails becoming a living example of what can happen when someone chooses authenticity over acceptance, growth over approval, and truth over comfort. Your very presence serves as evidence that there are alternative ways to live. You're learning that your sensitivity, which at one point seemed like a liability, is actually a strength. You can shield others from the same manipulations you avoided by being able to recognize deceit. In a society that promotes numbness, your ability to feel strongly becomes a gift to people who once believed that their emotional intensity was a weakness. Others who are scared to leave the crowd are given permission by your readiness to stand alone when needed. Your questioned personal sensitivity has turned out to be wisdom. The social dynamics you witnessed have turned out to be universal trends. The structural issues you recognized have materialized precisely as you anticipated. Every aspect of your waking has been accounted for in the overall scheme of things. Your wilderness trek was about more than just your personal freedom. It was about gaining the courage and insight to guide others out of the performance and into their own true power. The world of illusion and the world of truth are now connected by you. You experienced the change yourself, not because you wanted that position. The whispers you used to carry by yourself are now echoed in halls that at last comprehend. You simply wanted the truth to enter without your having to drag it. You weren't looking for retribution or recognition. You were early, not resentful. You were straightforward rather than polarizing. $90 is a handkerchief for a mother's tear, a blanket for a homeless person, a prayer for a broken heart. You outgrew the performance they required you to remain in, not the individuals you outgrew out of pride. You're not celebrating being correct as you stand in the wake of everything you saw coming. Rather, you're paying tribute to the bravery required to remain awake when it would have been far simpler to go to sleep. You're realizing how strong it is to put truth before belonging, clarity before comfort, and development above the approval of those who were never truly your people in the first place. The narrative is just getting started, because you now recognize your actual purpose in life, to preserve the potential of saving, not to save everyone. You were called to create better systems, not to fix every broken one. In a society that encourages fakery, you were picked for being authentic rather than for being popular. Your sensitivity was your greatest strength, never your weakness. Your capacity to recognize what others fear, to feel what others wouldn't, to see what others couldn't. This was never a burden to be conquered. Rather, it was a calling to be responded, a gift to be respected, and a responsibility to be accepted. The community may be in disbelief, but you were supposed to see it coming, not as a prophecy, but as protection, not as punishment, but as preparation. For a world in dire need of those who can recognize the warning signals before they become catastrophes, you serve as the early warning system. Proceed in your chosen direction. Your distinct brand of awakeness, your distinct flavor of truth, and your special capacity to see plainly when everyone else is wearing rose-colored glasses are what the world needs. This experience didn't break you. Rather, it opened you up to something more. The conclusion you saw was only the making room for what follows. It was never the end of the story. And the future need individuals like you. People who are able to see past the facade, create beyond the delusion, and love above the fear that confines others to cozy falsehoods. You are transitioning from a period of being misinterpreted to one of being indispensable. You are a pioneer in the future world because of the gifts that made you an outsider in theirs. With the knowledge that everything you've gone through has prepared you for what you're going to build, take on that role with assurance. The truth only needs someone who is courageous enough to see it and intelligent enough to assist others in seeing it. It doesn't require permission to come. You have always been that someone. You will always be that someone. Chosen one, welcome to your awakening.